Hello there, my RPG lovers, and welcome to another video. It's been a while since we had an episode in this series, but in the meantime, I've been making similar videos, basically.
Maybe we can help each other out.
But now it's finally the time for another episode of Hidden Gems or Trash.
I feel for you. This is a terrible tragedy.
A series in which I cover various forgotten and sometimes underrated games. A lot of these games are recommended by you, so feel free to continue suggesting games that you want to see in future episodes. Anyway, here is the 12th episode of Hidden Gems or Trash. Hope you enjoy. Number 5. Korgan. Korgan is a very obscure action RPG that came out exclusively on Xbox One in 2018. So you need an Xbox One or any newer Xbox console to play this game today. It's free on the Xbox Store, kinda. I'm pretty sure that you can't even emulate this game today. Korgan is a simple action RPG with big focus on the gameplay. The story is pretty much non-existing. It has one boring cutscene in the beginning and one of the worst trailers that I ever watched for the DLC. Here is the interesting thing about the quote-unquote DLC. You get to play the prologue for free, and when you're done, you get the option to buy the DLC for 20 bucks. However, it seems like this so-called DLC is actually just the full game locked behind a paywall. The so-called prologue took me around 2 hours to beat, and I wasn't really convinced to buy the DLC. You control 3 different characters in Korgan, a warrior, ranger, and a mage. All of them has just a handful of abilities and attacks, but you can switch between them with a press of a button. It reminds me of Shadows Awakening, another RPG that I covered in this series. But compared to Shadows, Korgan has a very basic design in general. The controls are pretty responsive, but Korgan has some very annoying issues on the fundamental level. Targeting enemies don't feel very good, especially with the warrior. The ranger and mage feel much better to control, especially the mage. That's because the mage has the highest movement speed, and she basically floats around. I like how the game tries to make the gameplay a bit more tactical, because there are enemies who are completely immune to certain damage. So you will need to switch between these 3 characters in those situations. Although this feature feels really undercooked, as well as the majority of features in the game, to be honest. I found that freezing enemies with the frostbolt and then unloading the stronger arrow attack shreds all enemies. Some of them are immune to frost damage, but they still take a lot of damage from the arrows. All of the characters have one ultimate ability that has to be charged in order to use it. But only the mage ultimate ability is actually a bit useful in fights, because it's a big AoE damage. The ranger has splitting arrows, which does piss-poor damage, even though I invested the most points into the ranger tree. And the warrior, I honestly don't know, because I used it once and it killed me, somehow. Your 3 characters don't share the health pool or the mana, which is also supposed to make the gameplay more tactical, I guess. For example, if your ranger is getting low on health and you don't have any health pots, you can just switch to another character with full health. But if you die on one character, it's game over. You don't switch to another character, so technically you only get 1 life. Dying is no big deal because you just respawn on the map. There is some itemization in the game, which is functional I guess, but the visual progression is almost non-existing. Some of the warriors' weapons look different, but that's pretty much it. Using the menu for equipment is way more tedious than it should be, because you can't equip items you want from the character menu. You have to use this separate menu for some reason, which makes the whole process more complicated for no reason. Same goes for using potions, because you need separate potions for all of your characters. The mage uses mana, the ranger has energy potions, the warrior some other bullshit, and all of them use health potions. Equipping potions for all characters separately is a tedious nightmare. The game starts in a very boring dungeon, but you also get 2 more open maps in the prologue. I like those open maps a lot more than the first dungeon. The dungeon made the beginning area of the game really boring, because the level design is not very good in general. The level design in the dungeon is pretty bad, it's just a simple corridor where you have to go back and forth until you finish all the main quests. Speaking of which, the game gives you one main objective, which is usually to kill or collect something. Then after you're done, the game just slaps another main quest on top of that, which makes you go back and forth in the same map. That was a bit more fun to do in the last map because it looks better and it's a bit more open. The first two maps are pretty bad though, but the dungeon is the worst. That's why I wanted to quit this game in the first level, but I was curious to see if it's going to get a bit better. And to be honest, it did, but not by much. The biggest problem is not the level design or even the combat. Enemy variety and boss fights are just very bad. Maybe it's because I found the meta strategy for dealing with everything, but nah, killing things in this game is just not very fun. All three bosses I fought have one single mechanic and brain dead AI. I mean, just take a look. Yeah, all the bosses in the prologue are like this, and I highly doubt the so-called DLC has better bosses. Listen, there are far better older and newer ARPGs out there, so don't waste your time with this one. I just thought it could be a fun obscure game to try out for the video, and I'm pretty sure that nobody heard about it.
Just need to reload and I'm ready to go.
Number 4. Daemonica. Daemonica is an action-adventure game with RPG elements released in 2005 for PC. This is quite possibly one of the most obscure games that I ever covered in this series. It's abandonware, so you can't buy it nowadays. I had a lot of problems with the recording because most of it turned out to be a black screen. This is not an uncommon problem when I try to record such old games, which no longer have any kind of support from the developers or the community. But the game itself works great for me, and I didn't have any crashes, so that's something. Daemonica is heavily focused on the storytelling, for better or worse. You play as a beast hunter who arrives in a small village to solve a murder. This game reminds me a little bit of The Witcher. It has somewhat dark atmosphere and some horror elements. Come to think of it, there is no daytime in this game, it's always dark and sometimes it rains. I think it's an interesting design choice and there is a legit reason for that within the story. The overall vibe of the game is very appropriate for the type of the story that Daemonica is trying to tell. Even though the dialogue is not voice acted, there are a lot of narrated story segments. The main character is narrating those segments every time that something notable happens.
I don't usually rejoice in the victory over somebody so wretched, but this time I had to smile for the first time in a long time when I saw the horror in his eyes.
He's a beast hunter, and I don't think I need to explain why he reminds me of Geralt from The Witcher. There is a ton of dialogue in this game, so you need to do a lot of reading. I'm not exactly crazy about reading in RPGs, but it all depends on how the game is presented. Most modern RPGs, which have a bunch of dialogue, are easily digestible because of the presentation, and the voice acting helps a lot, obviously. But even when these games don't have any voice acting, it's really important to present the dialogue in a right way that's not going to overwhelm you and make the dialogue and the story boring. The thing is, the story in Daemonica is actually quite good. It starts off with a simple murder investigation and it turns out into something a lot bigger than that. I mean, it's obvious that something bigger is happening because you play as a beast hunter. There's not a ton of NPCs that you can interact with, but they all have a lot of things to say. The problem is, a lot of the dialogue is not important for the story. There's also not a clear indication which dialogue can progress the main story, although it won't take long for you to find the right NPC. The village is not very big, and there are only a handful of houses and buildings that you can enter. This will expand a bit when you progress through 5 different acts, but overall the map is very small. You're going back and forth, do a lot of talking, some fighting here and there, and solve puzzles. You're trying to solve a murder, but the mayor has already executed the suspect. It turns out that guy was innocent, but that was kinda obvious. It's a well-written story, but like I said, the presentation is not very good. There are just walls of text in a lot of these dialogues, which quickly gets boring. So if you don't mind the bad presentation and everything I had to say about this, you're probably going to enjoy the story in this game. I personally rarely play any game just for the story, even when I know it's really good.
An empty table won't help me much.
So what about the gameplay? Well, the combat encounters are few and far between. It's very easy to forget about the fighting system altogether because the game is so hyper-focused on the dialogue and the story. I didn't know what to expect when I tried this game, but I certainly didn't expect this. There is literally two mechanics in the entire combat system, a simple click to attack and a block button. That's it. No skill trees, no character progression, no itemization, nothing. Well, you can pick up plants and make some potions and interact with some items here and there.
Excellent. Now I require the right herbs.
The menu has very extensive information about NPCs and the story, which is good if you get into it. As for the RPG elements, I guess the story has some important decisions to make, but I'm not even sure if they even affect anything. Overall, I think this game could have been really good if it had a proper combat system and a bit better presentation. You can play it only for the story and if you don't mind reading a ton of text. It's not a very long game, but that also depends on your reading speed.
However, the stroke did not come.
Number 3. Anima, Gate of Memories.
This one seems more fun than the others.
Anima Gate of Memories is an action RPG released in 2016 for PC and current-gen consoles. This game looks like a JRPG, but the studio behind it is in Spain. So I'm not sure if we can technically label it as a JRPG, but you be the judge. More importantly, Gate of Memories is obviously going for that JRPG vibe. Visually it looks quite outdated, even for 2016 standards. The character models are okay at best, but the environments are very simplistic, with just a handful of visual details here and there. I kinda like the usage of colors, and there is a nice amount of visual variety within the levels, despite the lack of visual detail. The performance of the game is not very good. I was running it on the high settings and 4K resolution, and you can see my PC specs somewhere on the screen, which should be more than enough to properly run this 2016 game. But I had a lot of frame drops while playing, even when nothing significant is happening on the screen. The graphics in this game are very simplistic, especially when it comes to the world design, so it's obvious that optimization is not all that great. Anima is essentially a story-driven RPG, but it's focused more on the gameplay and action in general. Unfortunately, the story in this game is just not very good, to say the least.
I didn't come here to listen to your pointless speech. Give me the artifact. I will not ask again.
The writing is pretty bad, but kinda funny every now and then.
You see? Living evil puppets! Hell yeah!
Oh, shut up!
You play as a nameless girl, also known as Bearer of Calamities. In the beginning of the game, you're supposed to retrieve some important artifact, which was stolen by the Red Lady. That's a very creative name for the antagonist, but she has nice boobs, so who the hell cares?
Unfortunately, you've come too soon. I have not finished yet.
You're not? But I was told you were coming.
The nameless girl is not the only main character though. She has a companion called Ergo Mundus, and not long after the beginning, you get the ability to switch between these two characters. That's not unusual when it comes to JRPG design, and it kinda reminds me of Ys RPGs. However, Gate of Memories is very primitive compared to those games, especially when it comes to the gameplay design. Ergo and the girl have frequent dialogue interactions, which is supposed to keep the game interesting in general. He keeps calling her babe, which is, I don't know, it feels stupid.
Exet, are you kidding, babe?
And she keeps telling him to shut the hell up in pretty much all dialogue interactions.
Something like your teacher, eh?
Shut up.
The damn Supreme Inquisitor here?
Shut up!
Every dialogue interaction is voice acted, but the quality of voice acting is terrible. It's very painful to listen sometimes.
Enemy in the sky, I can launch them twice as high. Take a look, I'm in a book, you're reading ergo.
So what about the gameplay? Well, it started off okay, but it quickly gets frustrating for a couple of reasons. First of all, I don't think the gameplay in this game is bad, but it has some serious design issues which can just completely take the fun out of it. Interestingly enough, the game has some decent boss fights here and there, but everything in between feels very repetitive and annoying. There are just way too many enemy spawns on each and every map you explore. They keep spamming range attacks with aggressive aimbots, and it's very annoying because you always get staggered if you get hit. Up to the point where I started avoiding enemies as much as I could and just look for the next boss fight. To give the game some credit, the controls are not bad, even though the camera feels kinda floaty. You can time your dodges with no issues, and there are some enjoyable combos that you can pull off. Switching characters in combat is seamless, although a bit pointless. They have almost identical movesets, and even the talents you can unlock by leveling up are similar. So what's the point of switching characters in combat, you may ask? Well, the only reason for that are different enemy types which are immune to certain types of damage. So you're forced to switch between these two characters when fighting these types of enemies, which happens quite frequently. That would be perfectly fine if this feature was not so underdeveloped. It lacks polish and is repetitive.
Ignore that nonsense, baby.
Speaking of lacking polish, a lot of the cutscenes have segments like this. Maybe this is just some form of censorship or just a visual glitch, I don't know. The movement in combat is pretty snappy. You can fly from one enemy to another with a quick dash, a dodge, or just choose to fight them from a distance. The combo system works fine in this game. You can combine a couple of simple melee hits, you have a dodge, dash, jumping attacks, and some ranged abilities. I think this would be more than enough for a decent combat system, if not for such annoying and repetitive combat encounters. The concept of using weapons in combat is non-existing in this game, which also bothers me a bit. I mean, technically the girl uses the book as a weapon, but that's pretty much it. Ergo uses his hands, or claws I guess. Ironically, you can collect weapons as loot here and there, but it's purely for increasing your character's stats, you never get to use those weapons. Same goes for the armor, or the lack of it. The visual progression is non-existent in this game, but to be fair, most JRPGs lack this feature, which is unironically the reason why I can't get into most JRPGs. You can pick up some items like rings, which will boost your stats, just like the weapons, but I find that incredibly boring and almost pointless. On the bright side, I actually like the boss fights in this game.
Party pooper.
The level design is not exactly linear because it has some flexibility. You get different maps to explore and you also have a big hub area. It can be a bit confusing where you need to go to progress, but these levels have a very simple design, so it's almost impossible to get lost. At first, I didn't like the level design that much, but after a while I started liking it for what it is. Although the big open maps that you get to explore are pretty bad. There is literally nothing to see or do except the main quest, which usually includes opening some doors or portals by completing simple objectives. In between all of that, you have some light platforming and puzzles to do. The game tries to do something cool in those segments, like changing the camera angle, which works good enough. I didn't have any issues with those segments, and they break the monotony a little bit, which is exactly what this game needs. The puzzles are fairly simple, as well as the platforming. Unfortunately, I lost the motivation to complete this game, because it felt like I'm fighting tons of pointless enemies over and over again. It's just not that fun to play, even though the gameplay itself can be decent at times. And you definitely shouldn't play this game for the story.
Except me.
Overall, I don't recommend trying this game out unless you're able to get it on some deep sale. Number 2. Dungeons of Sundaria.
Such brave heroes. Pity your journey ends here. Come, heroes, and see the power my master has bestowed upon me.
Dungeons of Sundaria is an action third-person dungeon crawler with RPG elements. This game released on PC and current-gen consoles in 2022. I played it on PS5, but I wish I got it on PC because the console version has some very annoying technical issues. The game runs on 60 FPS on PS5, except when it doesn't. The frame rate is constantly going down in a lot of areas and high-intensive combat situations. So if you like what I'm going to say about this game, I highly recommend getting it on PC. Anyway, Dungeons of Sundaria has the most straightforward game design out of all games I covered on this list. It's a very simple action RPG where you're going to hack and slash your way out of dungeons, and some open areas as well. You can play this game in single player mode with no issues, but there is a multiplayer mode as well. There's even a split screen mode on consoles and the PC, which is always amazing to see. Dungeons of Sundaria doesn't waste your time at all, you jump right into the character creation when you start the game. There are different races and classes to choose, along with a primitive character creation system. The character models look very rough, but this game has some cool armor sets that you're going to equip. That's much more important if you ask me, and I already bitched about the lack of visual progression in some of the games we covered. Well, Dungeons of Sundaria doesn't have those issues. Even by looking at this character creation screen, you can tell that animations are not going to be very good. To put it simply, this game doesn't look very good and it requires much more polishing. Despite all of those issues, I had a ton of fun with this game and I'm going to continue playing in my free time. This game knows exactly what it is, and that's a mindless hack and slash dungeon crawler. The movement is very fast, regardless of the class you choose, and the action itself is quite decent. I played with a champion class and a little bit with a rogue. All classes have a very generous amount of skills that you get by leveling up. You even start with a decent amount of skills that you can use when they're off cooldown. They don't have any resources like mana, energy or stamina. As long as the spells are off cooldown, you can press the button. At least that was the case for the champion and the rogue. I'm not sure about other classes, but I assume it's the same. This simple design decision makes the gameplay very fast-paced. It didn't take long for me to memorize all the offensive abilities and just use them on rotation, which kinda reminds me of playing MMORPGs. Speaking of which, the way the quests are presented has the same MMO vibe. Don't expect a lot from the story because it's almost non-existing in this game, and the quests are just go and find this evil bad guy, collect some stuff, and that's pretty much it. Your first major quest is to find a Crypt Lord and kill him. He is the end boss of the first major dungeon. Not all of the maps are dungeons though. Some maps have open areas, which is a nice change of pace after you finish a long dungeon. The regular enemies are very enjoyable to kill and they have decent amount of skills they can use. But if you use all of your abilities and move around a lot, it's going to be very hard to die against regular enemies. All of the maps have different level requirements, and I assume when you get to much higher level, everything is going to be much more challenging. The way I play these types of games is I just brute force everything until I hit a brick wall, which I eventually did against this vampire boss that managed to kill me a couple of times because his poison hits very hard.
Your corpse will be perfect for my next...
So I started looking for the appropriate gear pieces to equip and tried to minimize that damage as much as possible. There is also a little bit of RNG because you don't get to fight the same enemy type if you repeat the same level, but the bosses are always the same. I was pleasantly surprised with the amount of boss fights in the game.
Assist me, sisters!
There are worse things than death. Come, let me show you.
These bosses have more than a couple of unique mechanics that you have to worry about. You usually have to explore every corridor of the map and pull some levers to open doors in order to progress further. I'm assuming that repeating the same dungeon on much higher levels is going to be much more challenging. That being said, I think the challenge is fine on the beginner difficulty. Each map has a recommended character level and gear, and you need to unlock hard difficulties by leveling up your character. Both of the classes I played have some sort of a healing ability, which helps a lot, especially in boss fights. Without those healing abilities, I think the game would be much harder. I also like the visual variety of these levels. All of these maps look fairly unique and interesting, but some of them were annoying because of the technical issues I mentioned on the PS5. Then we have the itemization, which is exactly what you would expect from a game like this. There is tons of loot to pick up with various quality levels. Almost all NPCs will drop some loot, and you can pick up a ton of it, salvage it for crafting materials, or sell it in the hub area. The hub area has some different NPCs where you can craft, buy and sell items and take simple quests. I always got excited when I looted a powerful new weapon or an armor piece. There is some variety when it comes to weapon types and different abilities that the class can use. But the biggest problem with the gameplay in Dungeons of Sundaria is the camera. It constantly clips with the enemies, which makes it hard to see what the hell is going on. That can be really frustrating because the gameplay is very fast and you need to have as much as control as possible to avoid certain attacks. The game feels very unpolished in those situations, and unfortunately it happens a lot. You can try to minimize this by moving back a little bit in fights, but that's not a solution to this problem. I really wish they would find a way to fix this, but if they didn't do it by now, I don't wanna hold my hopes up. Overall, it didn't affect my enjoyment with the game that much. I think this game is such a mindless fun even in single player modes. I'm assuming the multiplayer mode is even better, so I highly recommend trying it out if you like what I had to say about it. Number 1. Ultra Age. Ultra Age is a third-person action RPG released in 2022. This is a very underrated game, and I'm really glad I tried it out because it has a very good combat system. It's a game by a small development team and it has some issues that I'm going to talk about, but ultimately it's a game that I highly recommend. It came out on PC, PlayStation 4 and Nintendo Switch. I played it on my PC, the Steam version. It's a newish game, so it should work out of the box on your PC. Ultra Age has a very straightforward and linear game design. You play as a guy called Age and you begin the game by landing on Earth. Far in the future, the resources of Earth have become insufficient and its ecosystem changed because of the passing meteor. The shelter is the only remaining facility on Earth, and when the supply line was completely cut, Age lands on Earth to see what's going on and potentially to save the humankind. It sounds kinda stupid to be honest, but I was surprised with the quality of the story. It remains interesting to the very end, and the dialogue is well written.
You kind of look like him, but your personality is just meh.
Really? Deucalion must be handsome too.
The voice acting is very solid, but I noticed something weird. I discovered this game by a random YouTube video, and someone in the comments said that the voice acting is not the same for all versions of the game. And indeed, the video I watched had a lot worse voice acting compared to what I experienced on the PC.
We have to investigate that spaceship.
Looks like even machines don't stand the test of time. It's incredibly old. I'm getting a bad feeling.
We have to investigate that spaceship.
Looks like even machines don't stand the test of time. It's incredibly old. I'm getting a bad feeling.
I don't know what's up with that, but the voice acting on the PC sounds very decent. Anyway, H has a robot companion called Helvis, and they have frequent dialogue throughout the game. I enjoy the dialogue and NPC interactions, although it can get awkwardly silent until you get to the next cutscene or NPC interaction. There is almost no banter between these two NPCs while you're playing the game, and I guess some people will prefer that. Overall, the story was a pleasant surprise, and it managed to keep me invested throughout the whole game. Speaking of which, you can finish the game in about 6 to 7 hours, depends on how you play. I played the game on hard, so that certainly extended my playtime a bit because the fights can get very intensive. I really like the challenge on hard in this game because it feels balanced and it's not a tedious difficulty. Every time I died, it felt like it's my fault. So let's talk about the combat, shall we? The action gameplay in Ultra Age is very fast-paced and fluid. It's not extremely flashy like some over-the-top JRPGs, and if it was, I would lose interest very fast, to be honest. The controls are very responsive, and it never felt like I don't have the full control over my character. It works great on Xbox controller, so no complaints about that from my side. However, some of the gameplay systems are a bit convoluted for no particular reason. It takes a while for everything to click with you, no pun intended. You get 4 different swords in total, and each of them is used for different enemy types. You'll do more damage to certain enemies with a particular sword, but you constantly need to loot them while you progress through the map. All of your swords have a durability system, so they will frequently break. When the durability reaches low levels, you get to use a very powerful attack with the sword, which then breaks it. All of your swords have a special strong attack when this happens, which is effective on different enemy types. For example, you should use the claymores against robots, katana against biological enemies, and so on. But the game then mixes it up by throwing different enemy types all at once, which forces you to change your swords on the fly. This works surprisingly well because you can instantly switch the swords in action even in mid-air. The combat becomes like a dance with the enemies. It feels very fun to pull off successful combos and strong attacks without getting hit. It's not as easy as it sounds though, especially on hard. You get a dash ability, which you have to frequently use to avoid attacks. It feels very snappy to use, and it's not extremely punishing. Although some of the telegraphed attacks from certain enemies could have been animated a bit better. For example, you're going to fight this enemy type a lot, along with its variations. The animations for their attacks are not the best, and the game requires you to time your dashes properly. You can also use some special abilities, which gives you the same effect like the dash. You won't get hit if you time the special attack perfectly, which is not that hard to do. The character progression system in this game is not the best, but it's functional. You get to upgrade all weapons as you like, as long as you have enough materials that you gather from the enemies. These upgrades are pretty simple and not that interesting, to be honest. Everything you need for the combat you get from the very beginning, so it feels a bit tacked on. Although I would rather have it like this than not at all, so it's fine, I guess. It felt to me like the katana is the most useful weapon, so that's what I upgraded first, but you'll get enough materials to upgrade everything eventually. The katana can damage shields of some enemies, which allows you to execute them when the shield is depleted. You're constantly stacking all the weapons by looting them, gathering energy for healing and special power-up ability, unique loot for upgrading robot abilities or speeding up the time. Yeah, it's not rocket science, but you'll need some time to figure everything out, but besides all of that, it's a fairly simple and straightforward game.
Ignore that nonsense, baby.
My biggest problem with the game is the level design. It's just not very good, and some parts of it feel cheap and confusing. Each time you die, you have to clear the enemy rooms again, and the save points are few and far between. If you could skip some of these fights, the game would feel even better, if you ask me. I don't see the point of respawning the enemies in this game, but they obviously wanted to have that Souls-like system, just for the sake of it, I guess. The boss fights are pretty good, and I like their mechanics. The number of bosses is very low and there are some repeated fights, but it's not a big deal. I enjoy the boss fights a lot, even though some of them are a bit gimmicky. Overall, I really like this game and even plan to get it on my PS5. It has a great and addictive combat system, which can keep you interested throughout the whole game, and possibly the roguelike DLC that we didn't even talk about. The DLC is free on Steam if you get the game. I highly recommend playing this game if you're a fan of fast-paced third-person combat.
Wow, I'm touched.
And that will be all for this episode.
Unfortunately, you've come too soon.
Tell me, did you play any of these games? Leave a comment down below. If you like this series and my videos in general, hitting that like button and subscribing to the channel would mean a lot. You can become a channel member or a Patreon and get to see some of these videos at least a day early. Many thanks to all of my current supporters, and I'll see you in the next one.